All right, let's jump into another deep dive. Today we're going to unpack some really, really interesting stuff from the Bible.
Oh, yeah.
Specifically Matthew chapter 12.
Okay.
It's all about the Sabbath, miracles, and even
Yeah.
what's been called the unforgivable sin.
Yeah.
We'll be looking at excerpts from a website
Um,
offering some interesting perspectives on this chapter.
You know, what's so compelling about Matthew 12 is that it really captures the essence of Jesus's mission. You know, it highlights how he challenged the religious norms of his day and ultimately set the stage for, like, a radical shift
Yeah.
in spiritual understanding.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the source material really gets into the nitty-gritty
Yes.
of Jesus's conflicts with the Pharisees.
Right.
For those unfamiliar, these were the religious leaders at the time, super focused on following every single rule and tradition, especially when it came to the Sabbath.
Right. And that's where we see that first clash. Imagine this. Jesus's disciples are walking through a field. They're hungry, so they pluck some grain to eat.
Right.
Seems harmless enough, right?
Yeah, of course.
But to the Pharisees, this was a huge no-no,
Huge.
a violation of the Sabbath laws because it was considered work.
It seems like such a minor thing,
I know.
but it really gets to the heart of how Jesus viewed the law
Yeah.
versus how the Pharisees did pain. He even uses a story from their own scriptures about King David, who also broke the Sabbath rules out of necessity and wasn't condemned.
Right.
What do you make of that?
Well, it shows that Jesus wasn't about blindly following rules, you know? He was all about compassion and doing what was truly right in a given situation. Think about it. Haven't you ever encountered a situation where maybe bending the rules a bit was the more compassionate thing to do?
Definitely. Like, what if a rule says you can't do something, but someone's safety depends on it?
Yeah.
You'd have to make a judgment call, wouldn't you?
Exactly. That's where discernment and understanding the spirit of the law come into play. And this tension between Jesus and the Pharisees only intensifies in the next encounter, this time inside a synagogue.
Oh, right, where Jesus heals the man with the shriveled hand.
Yes.
And predictably, the Pharisees pounce on him, questioning whether healing is allowed on the Sabbath.
Right.
It's almost as if they were looking for any excuse to challenge him.
It really reveals their mindset, doesn't it?
Totally.
They were so fixated on the rules that they missed the point entirely,
Yeah.
that a man was suffering and Jesus had the power to help him.
And, Jesus uses their own logic against them,
He does.
pointing out that they would rescue a sheep from a pit on the Sabbath.
Right.
So why not extend that same compassion to a human being?
It's such a brilliant argument. He dismantles their hypocrisy and highlights the absurdity of prioritizing rules over human well-being. But what's also interesting here is the role of the man's own faith, you know? He believed Jesus could heal him, and that belief, combined with the action of extending his hand, seems crucial to the miracle.
That's a powerful point.
Yeah.
You often hear people say it takes faith,
Mm-hmm.
but it's more than just hoping.
Yeah,
It's about believing and acting on that belief, even when things seem impossible.
absolutely. And this whole encounter really sets the stage for the escalation of the conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees because, let's be honest, witnessing a miracle like that
Right.
is pretty hard to ignore.
Well, they tried to ignore it, didn't they?
They did.
They went so far as to accuse Jesus of working with Beelzebub
Oh, yeah.
to perform these miracles. I mean, come on.
It's a shocking accusation, isn't it? But it reveals how resistant they were to accepting Jesus' true nature and his message.
Yeah.
They couldn't fathom that his power came from God, so they attributed it to something evil.
But Jesus isn't fazed.
Nope.
He calls them out on their illogical reasoning, pointing out that a kingdom divided against itself cannot stand.
Right.
It's such a simple yet profound argument.
It is. And it leads to a pivotal moment where Jesus declares that he drives out demons by the Spirit of God, signaling the arrival of the kingdom of God.
Oh.
This is a direct challenge to the religious establishment, a clear statement that he's operating on a different level.
This is where things get really interesting, wouldn't you say?
Definitely.
Because it's right after this that Jesus starts talking about something called the unforgivable sin.
Ooh.
It's a topic that's caused a lot of confusion and fear over the centuries.
Yeah, it is a heavy topic.
Yeah.
And, you know, understanding what Jesus meant by blasphemy against the Holy Spirit
Yeah.
requires looking beyond a single action or word. He's talking about a persistent rejection of God's truth, even when it's staring you right in the face.
So it's more about a state of heart than a slip of the tongue.
Yes, exactly.
Like in this case, the Pharisees were witnessing these incredible miracles,
Yes.
but choosing to attribute them to evil rather than acknowledging the power of God at work.
Exactly. It's a chilling example of how pride and self-preservation can blind us to the truth. And it makes you wonder, what signs might we be missing in our own lives because we're too stubborn or afraid to acknowledge them?
That's a great question to consider. But before we get too lost in introspection,
Okay.
there's another fascinating part of this chapter I want to touch on.
Okay.
The religious leaders, desperate to discredit Jesus,
Right.
demand a sign from him. They basically want him to prove his power with some kind of grand spectacle.
And how does Jesus respond to their challenge? He offers them a sign, but not the one they're expecting.
Oh.
He points them to the sign of Jonah.
Okay.
Remember that story?
Of course. Jonah gets swallowed by a giant fish and spends 3 days and nights in its belly before being spit out.
Right?
It's a pretty wild story, even for the Bible.
It is. And Jesus is drawing a parallel here. He's essentially saying that just as Jonah spent 3 days in the belly of the fish, he too will spend 3 days in the heart of the earth before being raised up.
Wait, so he's foreshadowing his own death and resurrection.
Exactly. It's a subtle but powerful way of hinting at one of the most central tenets of Christian faith.
Wow.
And it also shows that Jesus was operating on a level of spiritual depth that the Pharisees couldn't even grasp,
Right.
He wasn't about performing tricks for their amusement.
Right.
He was revealing a deeper spiritual reality.
This chapter is just full of these aha moments.
Right.
And speaking of revealing a deeper reality,
Okay.
there's that part where Jesus redefines what it means to be family.
Oh, you mean when his mother and brother show up wanting to talk to him, and he essentially says, "Those who do the will of my Father in heaven are my true family."
Yes.
Yeah.
It's such a radical statement for the time,
It is.
suggesting that spiritual bonds can be even stronger than blood ties.
It challenges us to think about what's truly important, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Where do our loyalties lie? Are we more concerned with pleasing our families or following God's will, even if it means going against cultural expectations?
It's definitely a thought-provoking concept.
I know.
This whole chapter has been a bit of a mind bender, hasn't it? We've covered so much ground.
I know, right?
From Sabbath laws to miracles to the unforgivable sin to redefining family.
It really is a crash course in understanding Jesus' mission and the radical nature of his teachings. But I think the real question for us is,
What's that?
how do we apply these lessons to our own lives today?
Exactly. It's one thing to intellectually grasp these concepts, but how do we actually live them out?
Right.
What does it mean for us to prioritize compassion over legalism?
Yeah.
How can we be more open to recognizing the signs of God's presence in our lives? And what does it truly mean to be part of God's family?
Those are questions worth pondering.
Yeah.
And, as we continue exploring Matthew chapter 12, there's one more powerful concept that Jesus uses to illustrate the spiritual state
Okay.
of those who opposed him. It's a parable about an unclean spirit that leaves a person and then returns, finding the house empty, swept clean, and put in order.
That sounds intriguing
Yeah.
and a little creepy. What's the deeper meaning behind that?
It's not so much about being creepy,
Yeah.
but more about what it represents. You see, the empty house, even though it's clean, symbolizes a heart that's been emptied of negativity,
Okay.
maybe even bad habits,
Okay.
but hasn't been filled with anything positive.
So it's like going on a diet but not changing your lifestyle. You might lose weight, but if you go back to your old habits, you'll likely gain it all back, right?
Exactly. And in this parable, the unclean spirit, finding the house unoccupied,
Right.
decides to bring along 7 even more wicked spirits. They all move in, and the person ends up in a worse state than before. It's a pretty stark warning, wouldn't you say?
Definitely.
Yeah.
It's like that saying, nature abhors a vacuum.
Yeah.
If we don't fill our lives with something good, something meaningful, then something bad will inevitably fill that void.
Right.
But what does this have to do with the Pharisees?
Well, Jesus seems to be using this parable to illustrate their spiritual condition. They were outwardly focused on following the rules, on appearing righteous.
Yeah.
But inwardly, their hearts were hardened against truth. They had created an empty space within themselves
Right.
by rejecting Jesus and the Spirit he offered.
It makes you think about what those empty spaces might be in our own lives, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What are we clinging to that might be blocking us from experiencing true spiritual growth? What do we need to let go of to make room for something better?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And maybe that's one of the biggest takeaways from this entire deep dive into Matthew chapter 12. It's a call to self-reflection, to honesty. It's about acknowledging that following Jesus isn't just about outward actions, it's about an inward transformation.
So as we wrap up, it seems like there's a lot to unpack from this chapter.
Definitely.
We've got challenging encounters, thought-provoking teachings, and even a bit of a spooky parable. Where does it all leave us?
I think it leaves us with a challenge
Oh.
to examine our own hearts, to be open to change, to embrace compassion over rigid legalism,
Right.
and to actively seek out ways to fill our lives with God's presence.
Maybe we can even think of it as a treasure hunt.
Ooh, I like that.
There are signs all around us.
Yeah.
Opportunities to connect with God, to show love to others, to make a difference in the world. It's just a matter of being open to seeing them.
Beautifully said. And on that note, until our next deep dive, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking truth.